Welcome to Morae's podcast series, Speaking of Changing Legal, where we discuss the leading trends and innovations that are reshaping the way legal work is done. Today's episode features Morae's Daniel Abramoff speaking with Justin Van Alstyne, Senior Counsel at T-Mobile, who discusses best practices when dealing with privacy data, eDiscovery, and information governance. The views expressed in this podcast are the opinions of the people speaking, and not necessarily that of the companies they work for.
Hello, this is Daniel Abramoff. I'm on the business development team at Morae, and I'm speaking with Justin Van Alstyne, Senior Counsel at T-Mobile. Justin's legal career started 15 years ago while practicing at a prestigious law firm, and in 2017, he went in-house at T-Mobile. He currently heads up their eDiscovery and information governance programs. Today, Justin and I will be discussing best practices for dealing with privacy data, eDiscovery, and information governance. Thank you so much for taking the time, Justin. Appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, Daniel.
Global data consumption grew more than 30% last year, driving governments to greatly expand data privacy laws. Justin, how have these new laws impacted the approach to eDiscovery and information governance within a large organization like yours?
Right. The short answer is they've had huge impacts, right, on any large organization, T-Mobile included. I think the biggest challenge that places, there's a ton of proliferation of new sources of data like Slack, all sorts of Teams, all sorts of data sources that 10 years ago weren't as big of a concern, right? But then I think the biggest angle on it really is it sort of highlights the nexus, right, between your InfoGov function, your privacy function, and your eDiscovery function. Because with this much more data, your biggest challenge as a counsel in this sort of space is knowing what you have, right? I can get a discovery request that says, give me all communications related to X, Y, or Z contract. But unless I know where to go to get that stuff, that's a pretty challenging thing to do. And what you don't know, and I think this will probably come up a couple times in the interview, is what you don't know is many times more dangerous than what you do know. It's like that Donald Rumsfeld, your known unknowns versus your unknown unknowns. Your unknown unknowns are really your biggest risks to your organization. And so I think the biggest thing there is making sure that, because if you're responding to a DSAR or something like that, really the reason a lot of times you have to caveat it so much is because a lot of organizations aren't entirely sure where each of those data elements are. And I think that's really the challenge going forward in sort of our brave new world of privacy, discovery, InfoGov, all nexus of those three.
Absolutely. And I think that is going to be a topic we're going to touch on is interlinking those different parts of the organization and having proper communication and relationships being built.
Right.
Regulators have heightened rulemaking and enforcement to strengthen record keeping, data retention, and data deletion requirements. Can you provide insights into how one can enhance their records retention policy to align with evolving privacy regulations?
So, and this is just my opinion, Daniel, but I think those are all intricately related, right? Your records retention schedule is your opportunity to sort of set, the high level policy that's going to dictate when, we should be deleting data. And of course, that's been the new trend lately. Probably 5-6 years ago, it was much more common for records retention to focus on the minimum or the maximum, you have to retain it for at least this amount of time, right? And now it's more this is the maximum amount of time we want it to be retained as well as the minimum, right? So that takes a little bit different of a focus, because when you're only worried about retaining it for a minimum amount of time, auditing and that sort of classification and sort of knowing what you have is a little bit less important because you're basically saying as long as you meet this minimum, whatever else you're doing is good. But when you start saying that's both a min and a max, then you start having to figure out, okay, is my business actually deleting this stuff? And do they even know, right? Because here's the thing, and this is what you run across a lot in any large organization. Data proliferates, and that's just a fact. If you don't have good controls around it, you're going to find data that's, you might have your system of record over here, But at the same time, what if someone took an extract from that, right? And they put it on, like just a server somewhere and haven't thought about it for like 2 or 3 years, You have to get control of that data now because, again, because of the laws, regulations that you're referencing, and sort of getting more of a system where we're being intentional about what kind of databases that we're creating, what kind of data we allow people to have, how long we allow them to have it, right? So simple things like, if you're using this extract to make a business case for like an ad campaign, you need to be deleting that data within, say a week, 2 weeks, whatever, of that analysis being complete, right? Or anonymize it, right? So there are a number of ways you can attack it, but I think the important thing is that you're the only way to deal with this is by sort of unifying, and not maybe unifying, but working together with discovery, infogov, privacy, and IT, right? All sort of forming together a table, right, upon which the defensibility of your data structure really rests.
Thank you so much for that. That was very, very interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Without a proper data retention policy, organizations could face legal challenges in the future, just like what we were discussing. What measures should be in place to ensure that the data is properly managed and deleted when it's no longer needed?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting thing, right? Because this is really where the challenge comes in. A number of the new privacy laws set up conflicting requirements with record retention, and often, especially, like your standards for different federal, state laws, federal agencies, are often in conflict, right? Because you might, just because something can be deleted, like say, again, this is we've talked a little bit before, and it's like, and this is a good example. So like a social security number, say you have my social security. Well, you might have that for multiple purposes. One purpose might be for the purposes of employing you, right? Which has a different records retention requirement from, say, if I applied for credit with you, right? It's the same data element, but it's very different records that you have to retain for. And I can tell you, as someone who does this, like there are different retention requirements for each of those sets of data. So it's not enough to merely, classify an element in a system. You have to understand what that system is being used for, right? So like when you're thinking about the new laws, right, in my opinion, the key really is making sure you're having a robust conversation where you're documenting and and making sure you have all these things lined up where not only like what data elements are in a system, but why is that system there? Like what does it do? This is your like credit approval system or something like that. Well, that's going to have different retention requirements and different requirements under the California law. And again, every state is sort of a little bit different too, which is always fun. But you have to think about that and how they conflict, right? Because there's usually easy exceptions for, if the exception I think is if required by law or like a legal demand or something, you're allowed to get around like a DSAR. And I'm paraphrasing there, but like making sure that you understand all those aspects and how they interact with each different set of data and that you've documented that, I think is the sort of the, like the nexus of that legal challenge there.
Very interesting. Maybe someday you can take the documentation that you've put together and put together a novel. Although I don't know if you'd be allowed to, but to me that sounds very fascinating because it's almost like you're exploring and you have to obviously write down your findings because there's endless amounts of data to explore.
Yeah, no, that's a big part of it, Daniel. I really think like in this role, like you have to have sort of an innate curiosity and a desire to actually understand how things work. It's not enough to just go out there and talk to me. Like you have to actually want to dig down and figure out like on a very granular level, how does this thing that I'm talking about work and what does it do, right? It's not just like the what is in here, which is like the simplest thing, like getting the list of fields and data elements, but like also like how does the business use this? Like, how does it function within the ecosystem of the company? And then like, why do we use this instead? Because usually you can find different data in different places. So understanding why the business chooses this over other things really informs like you being able to say, okay, and really get your arms wrapped around, all right, I need to go to these types of data systems, to respond to a DSAR, and this is why, and this is, how the response for each one is going to differ. And I think that's what most large organizations right now we're really trying to get our hands around that because it isn't as cut and dry as it might seem, and it does take quite a bit of work. And again, curiosity, I think, is one of the key character traits for anyone who's doing this.
Absolutely. I think that if anyone were to really peek under the hood of what someone like yourself is doing, they would quickly understand how many different areas that you would pretty much have to either become an expert in or learn up on and really understand so that you can swim with that lane, which I think is just incredibly, it's just very interesting to be able to accomplish those different fields. It's very important for an organization to watch out for any potential data breaches or incidents that could impact both privacy and eDiscovery processes. What are some good ways for a company to monitor those situations?
So yeah, I mean that's a really really big question, right? So and every company these days is dealing, I think, with an increase in data breaches, cybersecurity incidents, all those sorts of things, right? So you start out from a base level. You need to like the organization needs like a cybersecurity team. That seems obvious, but in some organizations that is an initial challenge of getting that. But once you have sort of that base level ability to respond to an incident, right, a data breach, things like that, and that's the other thing is you need to be monitoring, right? Companies have a duty to monitor what's going on and to uncover these things. It's not merely enough to just sort of sit back and think everything's fine, because again, like if you think you don't have any exposure, that's probably because you're ignorant, not because you're that good, right? But beyond that, right, setting up those capabilities, it's really in the legal department is really about like having a solid plan of action for when these things occur, because they will occur. And what I mean by that is like setting up, is what you always want. You want to run these investigations at the direction of counsel to preserve privilege, right? And of course, you're going to be producing like both a privileged and a non-privileged version of the report, because you are going to have to answer to regulators and people like that. But setting up those procedures so like the incident response team, when they first get notice of a data breach, knows the first thing they do is reach out to legal, right? And you immediately have your outside counsel on retainer who gets engaged to run the investigation from the get-go, right? There should, ideally, there should be like maybe two communications that are not explicitly privileged, right? And then what you need to do is you need to make sure you have your incident response plan, really figured out, right? Who are you going to? You need to have the contract signed with Mandiant or whoever it is that you're going with, and then you need to be able to implement them immediately, right, to start remediating. Because again, one, the remediation is important, but also two, figuring out what your reporting obligations are, which is why you retain the counsel, why you also have Mandiant or whoever it is, to figure out, right, okay, so these are the people, this is how the data elements that got breached, these are the people that got breached, these are the states that are impacted, right? Because in knowing all 50 state laws, that's another potential trap for the unwary, and why you need outside counsel in this, and making sure that you've met those reporting obligations, because they come very, very fast and furious. And most of the time, these data breaches are semi-public, right? It's pretty rare that we get one where it's no one in the public has any clue that it's occurred. Usually these are things that are being posted on the dark web, and you've got like Motherboard, TechCrunch, whoever, that's their job. It totally makes sense. They're supposed to do this, right? But and they might know part of the story, maybe not all of it. So you have to be really careful, because you have to mitigate around that and sort of meet those deadlines, even though in many cases it's very difficult to do so. So that's like the really long-winded answer, but short answer is like make sure you have a plan and that you know how to implement it before like a breach happens.
No, that's a great point, and putting that type of plan in place seems to definitely would take not only a massive effort, but an ongoing effort. Do you find that updating that type of a plan is helpful, or do you find that kind of keeping to what you know best in that realm is the best way to handle that as well?
Well, so I'm a football coach as well as like a discovery, head. So it's kind of like with that, right? You're building off of what you've learned every week previously in football, right? And so I'm adding a little bit more each time. And it's the same thing with this, right? I think you you want to stick to your fundamentals, like the things that are really important that you can't, like I don't know that you'd ever change like the structure of engaging your outside counsel, right? Engaging the remediation vendor, engaging your incident response team. But you're certainly going to learn from incidents and you're going to update those depending on, what you're seeing, right? And that's honestly, I know that for every organization it's like this, every breach is an opportunity to learn, right, about how you can, and not just right, how you can respond to the incident better, but how you can, more prophylactically protect your customers or whoever's information. Because, again, customer breaches are, usually the most publicized, but those are certainly not the only kinds that are out there, right? You have a lot of different flavors. And you have to be able to think about, this in a multifaceted way to try to give it there. But Daniel, the point is, I definitely agree that, if you're in this space, like constant improvement has to be one of your key values. And again, like is what I was talking about earlier, like curiosity, right? You have to be able to be curious about these things and to understand how they work together and again, at the end of the day, it's how do complex systems fail? That's really the nut of the question, right? And digging into that, you have to enjoy kind of trying to figure that out because it is definitely a challenging space.
But I'm sure it's quite satisfying when you actually find those different areas that
are for a certain type of person. Yeah, no, we're kind of you have to be a little bit nuts to do this, but yeah, no, that's right. That's right.
Data maps help large organizations track and manage their data and are important to attain to get to data classification. Could you share some insights on the integration of data mapping and classification tools to enhance our understanding of how data relates to privacy, eDiscovery, and information governance?
Sure. And I think so first of all, like a data map is one of the most useful things you can have, right? But you do have to be careful because they're almost always out of date the second you make them. So that's why you have to make sure that you've got a really robust relationship with the business, like IT, and that you're getting looped in whenever something changes. Because that's your biggest risk, right? Like I remember I did basically a whole company data map for I can't remember if it's part of the second request or if it's part of the HSR, but for the Sprint merger, right? The gigantic merger. And so literally my job was to go around and figure out, every data system in the company. At this point, and that was in 2018, 2019. At this point, that's almost completely outdated. What is it? 4 years later. So it's something, and in doing it, you have to realize it's a living document. That's the biggest thing. Don't think you can do it once and then get it done. This has to be someone's job to constantly refresh this and stay on top of it. And that's like really the gist of it there is that those relationships and that information flow that's going from the business to IT, then to legal, right? Whether that be discovery, infogov, privacy, those are all related, right? That has to be a continuum there and not just like a one-off sort of thing. And that's like in look, if you're in a smaller organization and you don't have the resources for this, believe me, I totally understand resource constraints. I think the idea is to maybe set up a cadence for it then. If you can only do it once a year, do it once a year. But that sort of stuff, again, it'll inform like how you respond to a DSAR, how you put records retention on things, how you respond to discovery requests, right? Where does this stuff that this litigant is asking me for, where does it live? And where does that differ throughout time? Right? Like the system that you're grabbing customer records from in 2018, to the extent those are relevant, might very well be different than 2023. So I think you have to be able to keep those things somewhat fresh. And again, Daniel, I think it all goes back to curiosity at the end of the day, because you have to have that innate curiosity to figure out how this really ridiculously large, very complex system functions on a pretty granular level. Otherwise, it's very difficult to manage.
And a system that continues to grow, like you said, it's a living system.
And change, yep.
Yes. Yep. So that is
and it's growing exponentially, right? Like the amount of data growth that we've seen in the last basically since the pandemic has really outstripped anything we had previously. So totally agree with that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your thoughts on these topics. And I know that I can speak for those who are listening that this was a very valuable interview for many people to be able to understand what someone like yourself is dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and as well as the tips and tricks that you've come up with and you've come across to be able to share So Justin, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Daniel. It was a pleasure.